Buonasera a tutti amici e benvenuti a questa nuova puntata di The Flywheel Show. Questa sera sono con un ospite veramente speciale, sono con Ann Nocenti. So Ann, welcome here in Italy. It's good to have you here at The Flywheel Show. First of all, how things are going in America right now with COVID? How are you living right now?
Well, it's sort of people who make comics. Most of us do it at home anyway, so we're kind of used to being, in our studios. I'm sitting here. I'm painting these days, so I'm sitting here in my painting table, and so freelancers kind of were used to solo or family or couple potting and not going to an office.
Yeah.
But that said, we rely on comic book shops, bookstore signings, and conventions in order for the comics conversation, which involves a lot of craft. When pros get together, professionals get together, we talk about craft and what's going on, and that's been kind of sad to not have that, so. And Ruby Falls, which was launched, it came out, the first 4 issues came out, but the trade book launched, I think it was April.
Yeah.
So the whole world suddenly was very, very depressed. And because COVID hit, and then in the United States, we had a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests. And so even the kind of things you would do without conventions and bookstore signings, like social media. I remember at one point I was talking to Cara O'Neill, who is this wonderful person at Dark Horse, and Karen Berger, and we were like, well, we don't really want to suck the oxygen out of social media by doing too much. Rah, rah, buy my book, because, we were all more concerned with people that were dying and the Black Lives Matter stuff. So we didn't do anything for Ruby Falls. And we were supposed to, me and Karen Berger of the, Genius Berger Books line and Vertigo line, we were going to meet at NapoliCon and meet and we were so excited. Karen and I were like, I can't wait to be sitting and having a cocktail with Flavia Biondi. And that was probably the saddest thing for me, was when that trip got canceled and the that was really sad. But I'm gonna hawk.
We have it here, the Italian version. I suppose this is the same one you have it here. Yeah, good.
And behind me, you can see the U.S. version, and of course the seeds.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, Ruby Falls. I've reread it a lot in the last few weeks preparing the interview, and I think that apart from the settling in a North American city, the general story about the family could be set really everywhere in the world, because the way all the people in the story thinks about the woman role in the world is quite similar around the world. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that, there's this thing where we just lump old people together as a problem, and we put them in nursing homes, and I think that, there are cultures where as you age, you're considered to be a repository of oral history. You're wise. And one of my regrets is that I didn't not interview, but get like an oral history from my grandparents before they passed, because my grandfather, who is, came from Italy and emigrated here, moved to Pennsylvania, bought a piece of land that had a coal mine, it had a quarry, and he became a farmer, and they were completely self-sufficient. They used the quarry to lay the foundation for the house, the coal to heat the farm and produce, animals. They had beef cattle, cow, they had a dairy farm. And, you know, I talked to my dad about what it was like to get up in the morning. He had to deliver the milk with a horse-drawn carriage before he went to school. And I think that, you know, if to say something about old people right now, talk to your grandparents, interview them before you can't, and get their oral history, because both sides of my family had very fascinating stories. And so that sensibility went into the three generations of women in this. I mean, it's a murder mystery, and it's a real murder mystery in that, like, the things you saw in your life, or the things that happened to you in your life that were traumatic, and you buried them and you didn't look at them, those things are kind of lost to history. So there's a moment when the grandmother remembers a murder, and then the youth, Lana, the sort of the star of the book, she really almost rudely pokes at her grandmother and is like, tell me more, grandma, you know, like you saw a murder, tell me, what was it like, you know? And the mother, between the two generations, is very like, leave her alone, let these bad memories go. And so it, you know, that's the story, is a murder mystery constructed around, like, what is memory, how to retrieve memories, whether to let them go or not. I think it was somebody like Ingrid Bergman, I forget exactly who said, the key to happiness is a bad memory. You know?
Indeed. But it's quite good, because one of the things that Clara repeats is that when you work with your memory, when you think back to things, you're actually are giving your version of a memory.
Yes.
So you're changing it somehow.
You're changing it, and it's sort of weird for me because I've had a long career, but I'm always being interviewed for my time at Marvel in the 80s, and I'm always trotting out what I can remember. I mean, I spent a decade at Marvel in the 80s and made a lot of comic books, and I didn't write anything down. I didn't keep a diary, and we weren't taking many pictures of each other. I think there was only one film crew that ever came through, and it was sort of, Ron Mann is a wonderful director who made a film called Comic Book Confidential, where you can see interviews with people in the 80s, but it's so I, you know, when people say, what was this person, what was that person like, I'm like, okay, you're asking me to retrieve a memory that's 30 years old, and I want to say, don't trust my memory. You know, I want to say, this is maybe what happened. Sure. This is the stuff I remember, which was, for me, I remembered all the crazy stuff. I remembered all the zany shenanigans and the cut-ups and the weird, you know, and the bullpen was always something insane going on with, you know, especially because Mark Grunwald was a kind of a ornery guy who basically constantly wanted to explode corporate life with something ridiculous. You know, we weren't exactly corporate. We were an artist bullpen, but you know, he would stage like what he called whack-offs, and he would get like paddles and draw our faces on the paddles, and then we would all have a whack-off, you know, I mean, stuff that was just stupid and fun, you know, and so that's what I remember. And I'll repeat those stories. Then people will say, was there any sexism back then? And I will go, no, not that I remember, but maybe I just don't remember the sexism if there was any. So I would say that, you know, and I don't have a diary to look back. And so with memory, I tend to remember fun stuff.
Yeah.
Ingmar Bergman, to quote another Bergman, a different one, you know, when he was talking about his films, you know, he made Persona and all those great Seventh Seal and all those movies. He said that the memories that burn the brightest, the strongest, not the brightest, are memories of humiliation and shame. And I think he's probably right. You know, we kind of can flicker through things that embarrassed us in our memory, but those aren't necessarily the things I choose to remember or to trot out in an interview. So, you know, what is history if I'm trotting out the fun moments? I'm forgetting the humiliating moments, and I'm forgetting anything bad. Like, was there sexism at Marvel in the 80s? I don't think so. I don't remember any, but, you know, so I guess that it's a lot of that. It's being interviewed a lot about stuff that happened a long time ago that it inspired me to sort of do a Rashomon. What is the truth?
Yeah, but I mean, this is more a question related to the seeds, but we can talk about that right now. Do you think that if you had at the times social networks, memories would be the same or would be different?
I mean, I think that there's something. I'm not a media scholar or anything, but there's something weird happening. That's the reverse. It's like, you know, there's so much being recorded now. There's too much being recorded.
Too much information.
And yeah, there's too many photographs. And, you know, when you look at old photographs from when taking photos was rare. I mean, I took photos. I studied photography. I had a Nikon. I took some photos, but it was expensive to, you know, I had a dark room. I developed photos. Yeah. But I don't have many because it was expensive to,
yeah, I remember.
You know, and so you look back at moments in history when recorded moments were rare. They seem to like resonate with almost an occult power. And now you look at social media and it's like there's so many images, there's like no resonance. You know, or, you know, there's something weird going on that you'd need like somebody that's studying these things to talk about how it's actually changing our minds. It's changing the way we think about things, you know, certainly. And then to have it all amplified during COVID. I mean, I really worry about young people that are solo potting. I mean, being a teenager or a college age is like the time when, you know, your problems seem to be magnified. You know, those are really hard years. And the idea that that young people are in solo pods, right, is very solo pod. I don't know if it translates to your Italian audience, but isolating alone, it's psychologically damaging, I think. And we don't know yet. We don't know yet what this plague year generation that had to take a year out of their lives and go into a frozen time, you know, what's the impact going to be on them when they're older? So
that's a good point. Absolutely.
And so my second request, I don't know if was the part about me saying do an oral history of your grandparents, was that before we went live? If it was, I want to tell, you know, everyone out there, get an oral history of your grandparents before you can't, because I regret not doing that with my Italian farmer and restaurant owning grandparents. The other thing is, if you know any young person in a solo quarantine pod, call them, make sure they're okay. So those are two things.
They are both good points. And actually, it's quite interesting going back to Ruby Falls. The way Clara used new technology, it's quite touching. It's at the beginning of the book, so it's not a spoiler. I think she has problems with memory, and she used a cell phone to re-record messages for her for the moments in which she will open it, not remembering how she feels. It's quite touching. It's quite interesting the way technology is changing habits also with old people.
Well, and also I want to say that, you know, Flavia, her art is so spectacular. I think that people are going to start more and more recognizing how important acting is in comics. She really knows how to create a repertoire of gestures and the way the body sits or stands and moves, whether they fold your arms, whether even her first sketches. Like, I really didn't understand Blair until she did.
Yeah.
Especially this drawing of her sitting relaxed in her aerial. And then I was like, Blair is completely balanced and steady and strong. And I have a tightrope and I walk a tightrope. And so I kind of, that's why she's an aerialist. But when Flavia sent that drawing, and when she sent the drawing of Clara, she sent a drawing with, you know, all the photos tacked to the wall and all the little pieces of information. And when she sent the first drawing of the mother, Greta, it was just like, and then Lana, here's her first drawings for Lana, yeah. Which was like, you know, Lana was going to have the visually embody the noir aspects, and it's just the body language and body gestures in comics are so important for storytelling, and she has that, like, maybe the best I've ever worked with in terms of that specific talent. And like, the pages would come back from the script and she would nail every scene, and it was really a pleasure to work with her. And so I hope that American audiences start to notice her. I know she's quite popular in Italy, I'm assuming.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And how it was working with that, because I suppose you just spoke at the phone or something like that, or you just delivered the full script before she started?
Well, so Karen is key in this. Karen Berger, who, for those that don't know Karen Berger, she started Vertigo Books in the 80s. So we, you know, talking about the 80s again. She was really, one of her best skills was letting artists and writers find their voice. Like, really just speak, you know, don't speak through a superhero, speak your voice. And so she's instrumental for people like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore and a lot of the British talent. And so, you know, when she left Vertigo, she started her own line, Berger Books. And so Karen, when I told her the story of a murder mystery that where the clues to the murder were locked in the increasingly dementia mind of an old woman, she just said, you know, tell it from the viewpoint of the women, do the 3-generation female, and I'm going to find you a female artist. And that's like Karen, you know. A lot of people would have said, well, let's like make sure it sells and add more of the mob stuff and add more action and add more violence. And not Karen. Karen was like, tell the story from the 3 women's point of view and I will find you a female artist. And so, you know, that's the beauty of working with Karen Berger. But because I don't speak Italian, I wrote very tight, full scripts. But what I do is I write very simple, one line for the action, the dialogue. I try to keep the script to 1 page so that it doesn't overwhelm the artist. And I'll do like 4 or 5 panel pages, maybe 6, but I'll let the artist know that they can change whatever they want. They should tell the story. They get the script and they should tell the story however they want. Like, if you want to take, you know, 12 panels and put them all on 1 page so you can make a splash, you know, you can do splash pages like a full, you can do whatever you want. So Flavia would add moments or combine moments however she wished. But no, I mean, as I was saying to you maybe before we went live, Karen Berger, me, and Flavia Biondi were supposed to meet at NapoliCon. COVID hit. NapoliCon, you know, and it was the saddest thing because me and Karen were so excited to just have a drink with Flavia in Naples, and just finally meet. But that didn't happen.
But hopefully this is something that will happen in the near future. Even for this year in Italy, nobody's still talking about convention because
No.
of course the situation is quite critical too. The
Yeah.
hope is for the second half of this year, or hopefully for the beginning of next one, everything would be a little bit better because, of course, it's good to have this kind of conversation with people via internet, but it's quite more better to talk directly. So I
And
understand
also,
that.
culturally, as I'm losing track of what we said before we were live, but for me as an Italian American working with an Italian, I felt like even without mentioning, and in Ruby Falls, we didn't specifically say this was an Italian family, but I felt like working with Flavia brought out something that we share that is unspoken, even though we never got to talk, an understanding of what it is to be an Italian American, or an Italian in her case. But just something about the family sensibility, the generational sensibility. And the other thing was during, in the early days of COVID and the quarantine, a lot of people in America just loved how Italians got out on their balconies and sang. I mean, that was the beginning of the balcony music. And, so I think that even though we're all in lockdown, there were moments when we were like, oh man, Italy, they're singing on the balconies. There's opera on the balconies. And it made me, living in New York, very happy to see that as an Italian. And then people started singing and playing in the streets of New York too. So, I think there are a lot of like weird cultural things that helped us all. The countries helped each other get through this stuff.
Yeah. And do you think that Ruby Falls would have taken a different direction if you had worked with a different painter or with a different penciler?
Oh, absolutely. No, the story that you tell. I mean, and this gets into the mechanics of making comics. Mm-hmm. If I had taken this full script with no changes, although I wrote the script for Flavia, I saw her artwork and her drawings, and then I wrote the script for her and it influenced how I wrote. But if you took this script and handed it to 5 different artists, you'd get, 5 different versions, because there's the writer, there's the artist. I write all the words, she does all the art, but there's a middle ground where we're both storytellers. And so you can see with The Seeds, the other comic we're going to talk about, is that, David Aja, everything I sent him, he, shifted everything to tell the story in a way so that he was able to find himself in the story. A writer, you shouldn't just dictate, like, draw this, draw that. It should be, these are the images I think we need to tell this story, but then you find your images and put yourself in the story. And I think that you get a better story if the artist is coming in, being their own storyteller. And so you can see pretty much on every single page, Seeds, you can see how David,
yeah, that's the Seeds.
took. I mean, it's sort of like I wanted masks in the story because the air was getting bad, and David came up with the idea of using the gas masks. And and once we were talking about, because the bees have a big part in the story, and he went nuts with the hexagrams and wanted the whole story to have the hexagrams, like the hive mind, like a virus going through the whole comic, because one of our main points of view in the comic was from the bee's point of view, and from things in nature that seem to have intelligence by communicating, like ants, you know, there's a line in there when you know how when one ant shows up at the picnic, they all show up, you know, because it's like you put the sheet out and you put the food out, and then they seem to know and tell each other. And so there's and you know, David did a lot of great things, like, you know, if there was a tree, he emphasized like how the branches were reaching out and the roots were reaching down. And so the idea that there's an intelligence to nature, even though nature isn't blah, 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 yak, 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 like humans, you know, there's an intelligence. So we wanted that point of view to be, I mean, everyone's point of view is equally important in the seeds. So Lola's point of view, how can I survive without my phone? I love my phone, you know, and that's right from my feelings about how I, you know, I lose my phone. It's like you cut my hand off. And then the farmer, you know, when his pig looks at him and it's like, yeah, well, you know, I only gave you about 100 baby pigs that you ate, and now you're going to eat me now, you know. And it's like, so everybody has a point of view that is equally important. Astra, of course, is the journalist. She's kind of like trying to get all these points of view and cycle them through herself so that she can come up with some kind of a, you know, way to tell the truth.
It was quite interesting because the page that you just showed, the first one with Lola, is one of my favorite one. Is in the first issue, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite pages in the whole book.
It's quite good the way Lola is described, because you show somebody which is trying to desperately seem scenic to create an armor to defend herself from the rest of the world, but on the same way she tries to emphasize with everybody, with an alien too. So how Lola character was born?
Well, Lola was she was born from this idea that, and you know, I wanted the story to have. And literally, because I am so addicted to my computer and phone, I wonder, because I was raised pre-internet, and there was a certain freedom to being, you know, no one being able to find you and being able to run around in the world. And there was a lot more happenstance because you were looking at the world and going down paths that were unexpected. Because you weren't on your phone having a schedule and people texting saying, I'm over here, go over there, go over here, you know. And so I wanted to take Lola, you know, to a certain degree, all the characters are me, but, you know, to make her a young girl that didn't know pre-internet, addicted to her tech. And the idea that coming from an idea that, you know, I would like sometimes to go off grid, where there is no drones, no surveillance, no tracking, no streaming, no YouTubes, no nothing, you know. And so the idea that there would be a kind of a Luddite revolution where a bunch of anti-tech people said, we want a place where we're free from surveillance and drones and the internet. And the idea, so Lola was kind of like the last girl you'd ever expect to be able to get off her phone, but she falls in love with the alien race and she follows him into the zone, and she is changed. She's changed without her phone. So that's who Lola was. And you know, whenever you do a character, you write a lot of backstory. Like she originally, there were scenes of her living in her house with her parents, and they had a glass house, and the glass house was meant to be like, she was completely exposed in the way, you know, the internet is like social media. You put pieces of yourself out there. And so I wanted a sense that she was living in a glass house. And so that scene got cut, and but it works anyway. You know, it turns out in the end, most of the sort of origin moments of the characters ended up cut. and other things were expanded. Mostly when David got the script, he would expand some scenes and drop others. And in the end, I think you get her without seeing her origin. And
sorry to interrupt you. Please go.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I found it quite metaphorical, the fact that she's a character that cannot work by herself, no? So it seems like the typical young people. I'm not young anymore. I used to be, but which is very well connected to the internet, looking to everything on the social, everything, but is not moving outside the world to see how the world really is.
Yeah. And so she's forced to go someplace that she's never gone, with no safety net, with no, and it's quite wild what she throws herself into. She throws herself into the no tech zone with an alien. And, the alien is collecting the seeds of a dying planet. And, so and I love how she's so guarded. And she's so, I don't care. You love me, you don't love me. You like me, you don't like me. Who cares? But she does care, and in that scene where she sits on the toilet, and she's basically like, the alien says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Getting rid of you, of course.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want any part of you." And then, of course, she ends up pregnant. So,
of course,
with the alien's baby, so it's sort of like, why spend your life guarded and in a glass house? Like, go out there. So there's a lot of like things that aren't stated in the comic, and some of it was stated in the script and scenes fell out. And I think that the fact that it became a more cryptic comic is good in the end, because the reader can totally decide what it means for them. And me and David, you decide this comic is about whatever you want, and we're going to say, great. We're not in fact, the reader becomes more important. Whatever you find in it is in some ways more important than what we intended. So.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting on the journalist side, the consideration that she made about fake news. The moment you start repeating a lie, it turns into something true. It's quite what's happening very, very often with the social media.
Well, and we also we wrote afterwards. Karen had me and David both write afterwards, because the comic was written when Obama was president. I wrote the whole thing back then. And as Trump got elected, and the rise of fake news and the rise of Fox Media, just like so the comic is it's not a commentary on what happened in the past 4 years, because it was written before that. But at the same time, one character changed quite a bit, because my idea for the aliens, the only idea I had for the aliens to begin with, was that they would be really bad at their jobs. They were kind of just like, oh, I got this gig, I'm supposed to go to this planet and collect the seeds, but like, I don't know, I'm bored. They were supposed to be kind of like, you get a gig and you're faking it. You don't really know how to do your job yet. And so I wanted them just to be like that. And the one that changed the most was the main alien, who it started with the idea that how are they going to learn English? I wanted to have like some token thing as to why they weren't speaking alien speak that then I'd have to translate, how do they know English? So came up with this idea that they had just had a TV set and they were watching old things. And then when Trump got elected, it kind of shifted to the idea of that the main alien is just watching TV and mimicking the rhythms of the TV. And it's like lives in a fantasy world where he just, watches TV and then becomes an internet sensation because of the stuff he says. So I would say that guy, and David did this really beautiful drawing when you first meet him that I'm going to try and find here. This image of him as when you really can see that he's become he's become representative of a rise of something in America. And, David is in Spain, so I imagine that whatever was going on in Spain at the time, the rise, if there is a rise of authoritarianism and this kind of bluster, fake news stuff, that part of the comic changed as a reaction to what was happening in the present. The rest of it was, from the past.
But I think probably it's too early, but do you think there is already a change in the way things are, in the way you're living now that Trump is not anymore president?
Oh, yeah.
It's already changing.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is kind of breathing again because the whole time he was president, he was trying to start wars. He was doing all kinds of crazy things like tweeting stuff that literally could create a international diplomatic crisis. And so it was very tense living here, as I imagine it is tense in authoritarian countries where someone is like, where the top guy's crazy, so I mean, sure, it's something that a lot of countries are used to, who live in conditions where the the president or the prime minister or whoever is crazy and making rash decisions. So it's people have like relaxed because we all know Biden has been around for a long time. Everybody calls him good old Joe, good old Joe. He's been working, as a kind of a kind-hearted, but it's not like people are going to relax either, because we made that mistake during Obama. We were kind of like, oh, the country's in good hands. Let's just relax. And now, I'm not sure if you can relax ever, So.
No, we experienced something like that in Italy too with fake news. We had part of the government prior to this one, which more or less has the same way of creating fake news somehow. As a matter of fact, he's also a Trump supporter, so you can see there is around there. And it was quite funny because when you had the Capitol Hill stories a couple of weeks ago with the guys with the hat with the horns. We had from the same far right, let's say, the same things some years ago with people dressed like the Vikings because they wanted to separate the north of Italy from the rest. So it's kind of a craziness that it's moving around the world.
It's the semioticians, the people that study semiotics like signs, and they've really analyzed like every flag and every phrase and every thing people were wearing, and he's based on like there's a particular Norse myth for a guy who was kind of a trickster, Vol something, I forget his name, so everything, even like the original Betsy, the original flag with just the 13 stars is a sign of like white supremacy, with the original colonies, before all those nasty immigrants came. And every sign and every flag and every banner, they've analyzed like to try and put together just what is this racist white supremacist thing that is. And it's the country we live in, that's where we live in America, which we have, it's only 1776, it's not that old of a country. So, and it wasn't that long ago, the civil rights movement wasn't that long ago, it was the 60s, and previous to that, slave ownership was legal. So it's a country that still has to deal with, and I don't want to get too depressing here. We're talking about the Seeds in Ruby Falls, but it's a country that has to deal with first the slaughter of the Native Americans, and then the slave history. And we've got to just say these things happened, and let's face them. So
Yeah. No, it's quite interesting, the fact that those people, and believe me, we have seen people here in Italy that tends to create this kind of myths. It seems like it's just craziness, but it's very well studied, as you were saying,
yeah.
in the details. So you've got things that are there to mean something that is quite concerning, because I'd prefer to see just some crazy people going around for a day, but that probably is not the fact, and I think that all the Western democracies somehow are feeling the same perception.
Well, yeah, and I also think that one of the things that journalists have been saying is that, like, what they fear is an intelligent Trump. What they fear is that somebody will take all this energy, like the energy that stormed the Capitol, and do the next version of the rise of this will be a lot subtler and smarter. And and so that's actually something people fear.
Yeah, actually, yeah. But going back to the Seeds, one of the first things that happens in the story is that we see the wall, and for me, I didn't know when I read the story that it was written before Trump. But the first thing that I thought is that this is something relating to the America Mexican wall. Instead, it's something completely different.
Yeah, it is. It is, and that originally in the script, I had it as kind of the zone would have some kind of like makeshift crumbling wall, because I thought of it as more porous. There was even a scene in the script where there was a bar that was literally on the border, like a border bar, and you could go in one door and hang in this bar and go out the other one into the tech-free zone. I didn't see it as such a militant, divided thing. And then I think David was at what's the famous French Comic-Con? There's a famous French Comic-Con, Andelin. Anyway, and there was a French military presence there with tanks, and he just said, well, let's make it, let's, and then, like, as a writer, at first you're kind of like, well, if I change this changes, this changes, this changes, and everything changes. And I was like, okay, but he wants to draw this, so we go with that. And then what happens is that it resonates in different ways, because, the tanks become that, that very famous moment in Tiananmen Square when the kid, tries to stop a tank. We ended up putting a scene resonant of that in the third issue, when the beekeeper, tries to stop the alien from, knocking down a tree full of bees. And so you kind of say at first you're kind of like, oh, that's going to like change a lot. And then you just sort of roll with it. And, and then sometimes you have to do something expositional, which I hate, which became, once the wall got very like militaristic, there's a moment when Race, the alien, goes through the wall. I had a line that was like, when the bar's open, the guards go away. And it's like, okay, because how did he get through if it's so militaristic? So you go, okay, I hope nobody notices that really bad, stupid exposition line, but you have to do it to explain the unexplainable, but it is a comic, so
Well, I was thinking yesterday while I was preparing the question for you, that by reading the character you created, the Mojo, back in Marvel Comics, you were the first people that introduced to me the concept of reality show. So you're in a way that was a part that Mojo lives in a world where everything is related to news, television, fake news. But it was incredible because you were able to see 30 years in the future at the time.
Well, and Mojo is definitely Mojo and the Mojoverse and alternate versions of reality that were in long shot 30, I think it's now almost 35, 40 years ago, that it is definitely in the seeds. It's definitely in the seeds. And I think that in the 80s, when I was at Marvel, I really wanted to be a journalist. And I studied journalism. I was reading Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, about how, history is manufactured by, there's different phrases like whoever prints the news owns history, And in fact, in the seeds, I really wanted Scoop, the news office, after everything crashes and there's no internet. There's even a scene that got cut where she rolls out her grandfather's old printing press so that they can hand crank and send out like broadsheets the way they used to disseminate the news. And so yeah, it's all like Mojo's world feeds into this, and and then the printing press was one of the scenes that went.
Yeah. So, and you started as an editor back in Marvel Comics, and now you're working with Karen Berger, which was very famous first in Vertigo, now with the Berger books. How the work of editor changed in these years?
Well, I think for me, the fact that I stumbled into writing comics and started my comic career writing superheroes, I've always wondered what would have happened if I hadn't gotten that job at Marvel and I was making my comics the way everyone made comics back then. You just sit home and pressed them and stapled them together and gone to the early conventions and sat around with my comics. And part of me wonders, would I have had a different voice if I had been among the indie people making comics, and Xeroxing them? And so I would say that I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I have always wondered what my stories would have been if I hadn't stumbled in on the superhero, pocket sandbox. It was like the sandbox where you're given the toys. You don't have to make a toy. You're given a toy to play with. And that toy has a little book that comes with it that's like, this character is, now these characters are 80 years old. Back then they were, only 50 years old, that you can like, and so you're riffing on what went before you, and you're riffing on an icon, and you're playing with a toy that's been handed to you. And it's a very different feeling to make your own toys. So, I still don't know if I'm answering your question.
But I mean, when I read your Daredevil, it was interesting because, of course, it was all published. I believe it's 95, 96 here in Italy. So it was coming just after Frank Miller run. Frank Miller run was, I mean, it is a noir. It could be set every time, everywhere in time, because it's not really telling anything about the city of Daredevil.
Mm-hmm.
When I was reading your Daredevil, I was reading American in the 80s, so I was very interested in the way Matt Murdock deals with people, and for me it was very, very interesting the way he speaks with the young guys, with the kids that are very frequently present in the stories, because these young kids somehow were very well connected with the kid I was, because they are telling their concern. They were scared about the nuclear war, etc. etc. It was quite interesting because it was the first time that a comic book told to me something about America and not only about a superhero.
Well, it's interesting because, I loved Frank's run, and Frank used to come into the office, and, I really liked him. And he would always talk about how he wanted to put Daredevil into a filmic landscape. And so he was influenced by, whether it was Kurosawa or, these ninja movies, or he was pulling from the history of cinema. And so that was like beautiful what he did. He drew attention to a lot of foreign films that nobody was watching, because those were his influences. And he put Daredevil right into this tradition of Japanese filmmaking, and that was great. And I think that what I was doing, I was a little more influenced by documentary filmmaking, and so I was sort of also pulling from film history, but I was thinking more about documentary, and how, like, the Italian neorealists and the different documentary filmmakers that would, have no budget and would just sort of grab life and put their fiction in the life that they found in the streets, to, Rossellini especially. And so I was thinking more about that kind of sensibility, and like, well, I live in New York. Hell's Kitchen is right there. Why don't I just go and sit on a park bench and eavesdrop, and ride the subways and eavesdrop, and walk the streets and eavesdrop and watch, and put that in the comic. So a lot of that was sort of like the sensibility of the found object, like in art. There was a, you look at like the French surrealists, the people like Duchamp, that said, here's a bicycle and here's handlebars, and I'm going to make a bull, out of a bike and a handlebars. And so it was kind of like, well, this is what's happening, and I'm just going to capture it. If I had had a camera instead of, if I had had a little film camera, a Super 8, instead of working at Marvel, I probably would have, made films. So that's kind of where that came out of. And also, I've been thinking a lot about, especially when I have my younger friends who are definitely being impacted by this idea that there's this invisible virus out there that people can get just by breathing on each other, and how it's impacting how young people date. Like, can I kiss someone if they could maybe kill me? And that's like very, very profound. And it kept reminding me of when I was a little kid, and, the unstable political scene. Someone could suddenly start a nuclear war. And when we were little kids, we used to have to like go under our school desks and had drills. Like, there were constant like drills that you dive under your school desk because a nuclear bomb might be coming. And so there was a character, Lance, who was Bullet's son, and in Daredevil, and that was all that. It's like you could read those Daredevil issues about Lance being scared of nuclear war and wanting to hide, and read them with the COVID plague in mind, and you'd have this similar like invisible poison, So, and then also in the 80s, AIDS was in the 80s, So there was already that kind of like, can you like start a romance and it kills you? So, these are things that are really, really profound for people to be going through when they're young people, especially, so yeah, I mean, it's funny how that those stories could be read with a plague in mind instead of nuclear power. And then, of course, Bullet, his father, who was there's that underlying landscape, and then of course you have to have Daredevil fight Bullet. And, Bullet was explosive like a bomb. I gave him like a trigger temper. And John Romita Jr., who is, of course, amazing storyteller, he came up with this look for Bullet so that you were always kind of like, he was like a bomb that could explode at any moment. So, it all came together. Sometimes it all comes together, but then for every story like that, there's a whole bunch I did where, they just didn't work or didn't come together. But you have to just keep trying until you hit that resonance that works.
That's fantastic to hear about this story and the way you perceived it when you created it. Just a couple of questions before saying hello to you. And if you had the power to decide which character write next in all the characters available in the world, what would you choose?
I mean, I don't know. What I like is for someone to say, hand me a character and say, try this. I remember, I guess at one point, somebody at DC Comics called me up and said, would you do a Poison Ivy story? And I did a Poison Ivy story called Cast Shadows with this amazing artist, John Van Fleet. And, it was like just, you have to look at who Poison Ivy is, look at her history, and find something. And it's really fun to play with an icon. So for me, I don't have any burning desire to write a certain character. It's more that if someone says, do you want to write this character? I would first, before I would say yes or no, I would study them and think about them and find out if I had a story to tell that I thought would add another facet to the icon. Because when you're doing iconic characters, you have a responsibility to not do something that happened before, to not just do something that just cycles, an ordinary story. You want to add something to the multifacets. So, I had a lot of fun writing Poison Ivy, and it was a Poison Ivy Batman story. And I must admit, sometimes people call me and they're like, would you do this violent female, because they want me to redo Typhoid or come up with a new Typhoid Mary. Or they'll, like, literally, I got a call about somebody wanting me to do a Lucky character, like Longshot, but a new one for another company. And so sometimes I'm like, well, I already did that, So I think you can become typecast. And, I don't necessarily want to do another violent female character, because that was kind of, we live in a, I wasn't, I mean, it gets into what is a feminist and getting into having a feminist sensibility. I mean, what were we doing back then? Just sort of like having females be as tough and violent as the men. I don't know what kind of message that sends to today's women. So I don't necessarily want to write another violent female, unless I could come up with a new angle on it that kind of answered the question I just asked. Why should the female try to compete in the male world and be just as violent and tough as a man? So I would have to answer that question in a comic,
So how do you think the comic books have changed? I think they've changed a lot in the last 30 years, but how do you perceive as an insider the change in the way they are writing, and the change in the way they are telling messages?
I mean, I'm not the best person to answer that question because, because I made comics in the 80s when it felt like a garage band. It felt like the arts were exploding all over New York, be it like the music scene, the art scene, and it just, there was the East Village of New York was filled with insane, great performance art and bands and art shows. And so the 80s sensibility, the 80s comics were of a time where you had like, Jean-Michel Basquiat scrawling on walls, and you had like performance artists doing like incredibly like new and stuff. I had this friend, David Leslie, who called himself the Impact Addict, and he wrapped himself in bubble wrap and jumped off a roof. And, you had up and coming stars like Steve Buscemi, doing his stand up in little clubs in the East Village. I mean, it was a very exciting time for the arts. And then I left the field and I spent the 90s. I had a film magazine called Scenario, and I was a screenwriter. And then I began I was a journalist writing about arts and culture and politics. So I kind of missed the 90s, and then I kind of missed the aughts too, because I was teaching film in Haiti. I began to make films. And so honestly, I think I am not the best person to answer this question, because I didn't, and then I came back to comics. But what's fed into my comics is the continued conversation of how words and pictures go together in this art form, comic books, in ways that you can't do in film and just pure painting, illustration. And so, I think that's the stuff I think about, is that conversation. I'm not, although when I came back in like 2012, I came back to do some DC comics. And I remember going to Emerald Con in Seattle because I was writing Green Arrow, and that's his city. And I hadn't been to a Comic-Con in so long. And I was amazed that it was half women. And that is something that made me very happy. And then, of course, I got to find out that it was people like Kelly Sue DeConnick and her Captain Marvel, and Sana Amanat and G. Willow Wilson with Ms. Marvel, and in an independent sensibility, all the women that were writing graphic novels. And so to me, this explosion of comics made by and for women was wonderful to see, because I've always had like a weird feeling of guilt that I didn't do more for women in the 80s. I mean, it's sort of like I wasn't really writing comics for women in the 80s. And these women came in and they said, okay, we're going to really do it. And, Ruby Falls is definitely a comic made by and for women, which means that men should read it,
That's one last thing, Annie. Can you anticipate if you're working on something right now or not?
Well, I'm drawing again, and I'm drawing. I never stopped drawing, but my skills are really, really, really rusty. It's almost like, I played piano too, but I can no longer play the piano. So I'm finding my line is just not as good as it used to be. So, but I'm still using painting to try to find the next story I want to write. And so I'm kind of circling in on a couple ideas. So who knows,
Okay, when you publish something, you would be more than welcome to come to the Flywood Show again and talk. So really thank you for your time. It's been really a pleasure and an honor to have 1 hour with you. I literally grew up reading your comics, so I wanted to say thank you for the things that you brought. There are a couple of people
here. Final thing, these are indie comics. Indie comics means nobody's buying them, so please buy them.
No, of course they are great comics, but we are waiting for the seeds to arrive in Italy. But of course, Ruby Falls is available by Bao Publishing here in Italy, so it's very
well.
Easy.
Hopefully, Bao Publishing will do the seeds. I think they are going to do the seeds. And one of the things I love about Bao Publishing is how they do the little character in the back.
Yeah, the dog. Yeah.
and Flavia did this like autumn leaves that are all through Ruby Falls. So I'm kind of curious as to what David Aja will do in the for the dog.
That would be good.
Yes, dog, who will it be?
No, every artist actually on Bao is going to draw on the dog at the end of the book, so they will have to do this too. Okay. Really thank you, Annie. Have a nice day, and
you too.
Bye. E grazie a tutti.
Bye, Rayo.